Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Scientific Conferencing workshop and the Day 1 plenary session featuring Dr. Lucy Gilson. My name is Dr. Erica Spots, and I'm a health scientist administrator in the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at the National Institutes of Health. I'm also a member of the Future of Scientific Conferencing workshop planning committee. In this session, we will hear a presentation from Dr. Lucy Gilson, followed by a moderated discussion, including questions that are submitted by the audience. At any time in the session, you may use the Q&A function to submit your questions for the speaker. You may also use the chat function to share your thoughts and engage in discussion. I'm pleased to introduce our plenary speaker. Dr. Lucy Gilson is Dean of the University of New Hampshire Peter T. Paul College of Business and Economics. She is a world-renowned researcher on virtual teams and team effectiveness, and in 2019, the Web of Science named her one of the world's most highly cited researchers. Her work examines teams in different organizational settings performing a diverse range of jobs. Specifically, she studies how creativity, employee empowerment, diversity, fairness issues, leadership, and virtual communication influence team effectiveness. Dr. Gilson earned her PhD and MSM from Georgia Institute of Technology and her BS from Georgetown University of Foreign Service. Dr. Gilson, please take it away.
Thank you, Erica, and good afternoon, everybody. Or maybe it is probably good morning or good evening for some of you. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you at this conference. A fascinating theme and topic, and I have been popping in and out of sessions all afternoon to hear, what a lot of the panelists have been saying and trying to incorporate some of their points and messages into my talk as well. But it has been a really informative and exciting session, so thank you. I think it's interesting. So I come at this from a slightly different angle than most of the presenters that I've heard from today, because I'm a management or business school person, and so I have really studied virtual work, and in particular virtual teams, and how they can be used effectively, predominantly for organizational outcomes. So in preparing for this, it was sort of interesting because I don't actually think there's a big difference when we start talking about scientific conferencing, right? Because again, the people who are putting together the conference, so Erica just said, playing part of the conference planning team, that is a team. And I'm guessing, a lot of them worked virtually on this. When we come to a conference as attendees, and we've gone into breakout sessions, there have been networking timeframes between the different presentations. Again, those are virtual team members interacting. So I think that's sort of quite interesting. And I'm going to touch in a couple of different ways on the whole aspect of diversity, because I think that's such an important part of virtual work, and it comes in. It came in obviously all the presentations earlier, but I think it's also something that we think about when we study virtual teams, and you'll see in a minute some irony here. So this is sort of just touching upon some of the work that I'm going to talk about here, and you'll see that two of these pieces are review pieces. So one that we did in 2004, and then another one that we did 10 years later. What I mean by the irony here is that in 2004, Travis Maynard and I was a first-year assistant professor, and Travis was my PhD student. We were really interested in virtual teams, hybrid work. What did that look like? We both came from backgrounds that I worked at M&M Mars very early in my career, and I was one of the first people that was allowed to take a portable computer that weighed 30 pounds home on the London Tube. And I thought I was really hot stuff, and I had huge biceps. Lewis Martins came at it from a diversity angle. And so the three of us put together a proposal to do a review piece on how technology-enabled teams would help or hinder, what that meant in the diversity space. We submitted the proposal, as many of us do, only to be told, well, we think the virtual piece is really interesting, cut the diversity piece. So I think it's sort of ironic, right? Now, 20 years later, we're actually talking about the diversity piece sort of front and center. So those are sort of review pieces. Other pieces are empirical. Some of them are more practitioner focused. And then last year we published a handbook of virtual work, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But one of the things that is sort of interesting publishing a book on virtual work in 2023, right, is you'll see in a minute how we were slow to embrace working virtually and working remotely and what that would look like and how we could use it and being creative in that space. And then of course we all had to embrace it kicking and screaming in some cases, right? And so that handbook of virtual work sort of ended up being something that was well placed and well timed, but that was sort of fortuitous. So let's go back a little bit. I think we often forget that virtual work has been around for a long, long time. And I think what's also really fascinating when we think back to the early days of virtual work, it was really in our domain. It was really brought about to facilitate, scientific research, right? How can we share files? How can we share documents? How can we share results and findings, right, with people across places who do similar work, right? So it's not as new as people like to think it is, but, right, as with anything, there were not a lot of early adopters. People were worried about using this. I mean, you think back to your first purchase on Amazon, how nervous we all were about putting in our credit card information and how we do that now as second nature, rightly and wrongly in some cases. But again, from a researcher standpoint, right, 2022 is sort of 2020 was almost like a perfect experimental design, right? We could all of a sudden force people into having to work using these communication technology tools, and then really see what happened. To give sort of a end result first, one of the things that we found, which was great, was a lot of the things that we had found in small lab studies or in studies using students held true when we then sort of looked at what happened in the workforce. I do want to say, and Erica, this is going to put the pressure on you, but if people have questions along the way, I'm happy to answer questions as we go through. So, hold them to the end if that makes sense, but I'm also more than happy to move back and forth as we go. So what did we find out in 2004 when we looked at virtual teams? There was not that much research, right? I mean, we found 47 articles in management journals, 93 empirical studies. There was not that much work on this as a topic. So it was actually quite hard to write a review paper, if I have to be completely honest. But what we also found that was interesting is that while in the sort of computer science domain, there was a lot of work talking about how great it was to have networked computers and how it facilitated science. Within the management space, right, there was this sort of negative finding, if you like, right, that as tasks become more complex, virtual team performance goes down. So sort of the underlying assumption was we can use technology and virtual teams for really simple additive tasks. Now that's fascinating because it completely is counter to the reasons that we talked about earlier of why we wanted to have technology to mediate communication, because we wanted that so that we could get experts from around the world and people from different disciplines to work together. But it wasn't working, and we didn't really know why at that time. So that was a really interesting finding, even though it wasn't positive. The other finding that was interesting and still holds true is that meeting at least once face-to-face helped virtual team performance, right? And this was fascinating because, again, if we're thinking about, we're using technology for conferencing and we're saying, okay, maybe you don't need to meet face-to-face, the team performance was being improved when they met face-to-face. Now, we still find that, but, and there is a caveat here, now that we have much richer communication tools, that is starting to dissipate. But I think we know much more now, and I will touch on that in a minute, is why that finding kept popping up and holding true. So let's roll forward to 2015, and you can see we went from a paltry 93 to over 1,000 articles, right? So interest in the topic of virtual teams, and this was purely virtual teams at this stage, really accelerated, as did the negative perceptions of working virtually. So all of a sudden we were starting to see, the group of people that we call digital natives saying, oh, this can work, right? How do we make this work? We were still finding that virtual teams took longer to make decisions, but they often now made better quality decisions. So there was a lot more leveraging of the skills within the team to make better decisions. But, right, and this is an important but, communication within the team tended to be task focused. So what do I mean by that? And again, I think this is important for the conferencing aspect here as well. It means that when we get put into a virtual team, often with people we don't know, we tend to say, what do we have to do? How are we going to divvy up the work? And let's get started. So we focus on the task, not on the people, not on the relationships, and that will come back again. The other thing that we started to see as very important was the role of leadership and the role of planning, but yet there was not much focus on that. And I would say now that virtual teams can be as successful as face-to-face teams. However, leadership of virtual teams is actually harder and takes more planning and more work. And we'll talk more about that as well. So what was causing, to some degree, some, these negative perceptions and these teams taking longer, maybe not doing as well on complex tasks, etc.? One of the big takeaways is that in the virtual world, and this can be team, and this actually could be conferencing just as easily, is we focus a lot of our time on the technology, right? Do we have the tools? Can you VPN in, right? You all have IT people who are always making sure software, we're going through a cybersecurity audit. What's happening there? Do we have the right cloud sharing? Can you authenticate through your phone? What tools do you need for this meeting? Is your microphone, does your camera work? Right? We don't spend nearly as much time on the relationships and the people. Hence our little otters, right, who don't lose their partner at night when they sleep holding hands. And I think that is going to be a theme that you're going to see throughout. If we want virtual work, teams, conferencing to be successful, we've got to focus more on the relationships and the people. Because again, think about a lot of the conferences that we go to face-to-face, where we travel to Chicago, Atlanta, London, wherever it would be, right? We often go because there are some sessions we want to attend, but we often predominantly go because there are colleagues we want to meet up with, people we want to see, spend some time with. And sometimes the most valuable parts of the conference happen over a drink, over a meal, somebody you sit next to on the bus on the way to the conference hotel, right? The relationship pieces. So how do we bring that into, right, the technology-enabled space? Not 100% not by what I'm doing right now, right? Which is where I'm just talking at you, so to speak. And it's not I can't see if you're on your phone, if you're making dinner, if you're bored, right? I can't get that feedback. This is something that's interesting or not, and can I change it up? Or, I might think, oh, somebody suddenly picked up their pen and wrote a note at that one stage that I should follow up with you. What was it about that interested you, right? So those relationships, those people pieces are not impossible. They are harder to do. And the other thing that was coming out a lot out of this sort of early work is that in the virtual team space, is that virtual teams are first and foremost teams. And so while we were focusing a lot of our time on the inputs, right? Do you have a designated space? Do you have the technology? And the outcomes, what do we need to happen? There was much less focus on What was happening in the team processes side, right? The black box piece, right? How were we planning? Were we setting goals for how work was going to get done, or just the outcome that had to be achieved? Who's monitoring progress? How are we doing that in a developmental way? What happens when there's conflict? And how are we making sure that people know each other, right? So the critical pieces there. So let's move forward then to some of the things that then help teams work virtually. So I said earlier, leadership matters. Oh, why does it say push to audience? What does that mean? All right, push to audience. Hopefully you can see it. So I don't know if someone can give me a thumbs up or something that you can see that one, right? So leadership matters because in a virtual world, how we message, right, is interpreted in silos. So I receive a message from somebody and I don't know, right, how you receive that. So again, we're talking about, it could be people in their little boxes. Are your cameras on or off? Is it asynchronous? So leadership has to really think about what are we messaging, how are we messaging, and when are we messaging, and what does that mean, right? The other crucial thing, and this is, the recurring theme, is how do we as a team spend some non-work time together? And why does that matter, right? Because of that relationship piece of it. How do we get to know other people on the team? And I'm going to poke fun at some of my colleagues here who are who I've been presenting today, right? Because one of the things that we have moved to as we've moved to more virtual work are these virtual backgrounds. And, we all use them, and, I do too. But the problem with a virtual background means you don't know anything about the person who's presenting. So when you go into somebody's office, for instance, you look around and you say, oh, you've got a bottle of wine, you've got a basketball. That tells me something about you. And I make a connection. I say, oh, I didn't know you liked that wine. I like that wine. Not work related, but actually will help your project. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Once we start curating all of that, we take away the personal side and how do people know the other people they're working with? Come back to that. The other things that leaders, are going to really have to play a critical role on, especially in a virtual world, is what are the boundaries? Is it okay to send a text at 3 a.m? Is it okay to call and interrupt somebody? Is it okay to BCC your boss on every message, right? These are sort of cultural norms and boundaries that really have to be established by the leader if this, virtual team, virtual work is going to work and be successful. Think back to one of the things we said earlier, right? One of the advantages of virtual work is you can have the best people on the team regardless of their location. So how do we manage, time zone differences, different expectations, different norms with regards to speed of response, etc. How many questions one person can ask. So we have to really think about those things from a leadership perspective. So, the things that we probably all hated when we, in our master's programs, right, where you had to put together, a team charter, right, becomes really critical in the virtual space because it sets the norms, it sets the parameters. We are going to store all the conversations. We're going to save things. We're not going to save things. Today's meeting is a camera off because it's a working meeting and we don't have to see each other. And the piece I keep touching upon here is this whole matter of familiarity. And this is one of the things that I think is most important in this virtual space. Familiarity is both personal and professional, right? So do you have kids? Do you like dogs? What are your hobbies? Personal, what are your strengths and weaknesses with regard to professional? Both are critical in virtual teams because they facilitate help seeking and help giving. So it doesn't matter one bit if you're a cat person or not. But again, if you look in my office, and that's a bad example because I'm not a cat person. So if you look in my office and you say, oh, sardine tins, I'm trying to see what's behind me. So why do you have sardine tins? I was just in Portugal. Oh, I went to Portugal. Nothing to do with the task, but because I know something about you personally, I am going to be more willing to be vulnerable. So thinking about trust, psychological safety, and all of those type of constructs, and ask you for help when I get stuck on a project. So think back to what I said, the finding that we had in 2004. As work becomes more complex, we were performing less well in virtual spaces. Why? Because if we think back to the technology that was available to us in 2004, the technology was not as rich. It was much harder to get to know people, when you're just working on email or doc sharing, right? So once we start getting Zoom and Teams and different things where we can create some communities, right, much easier to get to know people personally and professionally, right? So personally helps dramatically with help seeking and help giving. Professionally helps because I now know who to go to when I get stuck on a problem, right? So instead of going and saying, can you help me with this? And you're like, well, I'm not really the quant person on this team, right? I know where to go. And remember, on teams, right, we don't have to know everything because that's the advantage of being on a team, but we have to know who knows what and how to find that person. So where do we go for those things? So that professional familiarity is really helpful. And this was a really interesting thing that pre-COVID, getting to know people on virtual teams was considered to be very difficult to do. The teams that did really well in COVID were the teams that had, now we can all roll our eyes and, I'll roll mine and you roll them and I can't see you, right? Those, weekly drinks and happy hours, or played those games where we said, everybody pick up your phone and put on the screen the most recent photo you have, and then let's guess who it is. I think that's Padlet, right? Is that platform, right? Silly icebreaker, yes, but it got people talking. It got people breaking, into groups who didn't necessarily know people. If we onboarded new people, again, help seeking and help giving. Norms are the other piece that are, really important here. Is it okay to interrupt somebody? And here, think back to when we're face to face, right? Somebody comes in your office and is like, oh, sorry to interrupt, but I have a question. None of us go, yay. Well, very rarely. An interruption. Yes, come on in. I'm middle of a project on a really important task, but you've got your question and you've barged in now. But what happens when that interruption happens? Usually we say, okay, what is your question? And the person asks a question and you respond. But then they'll probably say, look, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but this, and did you see this? And you have this little conversation about something that is not always as task related as the question they've come in to ask, right? How does that help? That helps us in our creativity, our divergent thinking, because you say, well, why are you interrupting me with that question? Well, I've got to do it now. Who asked for it? Oh, I didn't know that they were working on that project. Why are they on that project? These different sorts of tangential pieces get us thinking differently, right? Very easy, again, in an online environment to really sort of get into this linear thinking. And so interruptions, we have to plan for them. So maybe we say, I'm working remotely, but if you need me, text me, or it's okay to Teams me and just, interrupt at any time. We get a problem with the virtual world is things become very scheduled. There's a 15-minute break. It's a 45-minute session. It's a 30-minute call. But how can we, really allow for interruptions, people to come and go, and that will also spark our creativity. Or again, what I mentioned earlier, should we have meetings where we say, listen, let's have a work meeting, like we're all going to come. So sometimes we do this as academics, right? We call it writing groups. And we say, 10 to noon on Friday morning, we're all going to go into the conference room. We're just going to write. And after 45 minutes, we're going to take a break. And, then we're just going to write. And no one's really interacting except for in those little breaks. We can do that in a virtual world. Like, let's have a writing session, but let's keep our computers on. Our cameras maybe are turned off. And then if somebody has, when the time comes up, we're going to have a conversation, we turn our cameras on, we talk, and then we get back, right? We don't have to have the technology define how we use it, right? We can do that and create our own norms. This was in a session earlier today, which made me very happy, right? Trust and psychological safety are a little bit harder to develop in a virtual world for exactly the reasons we're talking about. We don't know people as well. So how does that happen? Speed of response, right? So I just saw a little one came up in the group chat, and I was like, oh, maybe there's a question I could respond right away, right? Speed of response helps perceptions of trust and psychological safety in a virtual world. Why? Right? Because we feel that people are listening to us, they're taking our question or our point seriously. Openness, feedback. It's actually better to give a short, quick response for trust and psychological safety than to plan out a very long, carefully crafted response. Now, obviously, there are times when you need a very long, carefully crafted response by the nature of the question being asked. But a lot of questions that you're asking, again, think about how we would respond in person. Oh, absolutely, that sounds great. No, maybe not. We don't have to always go through, formal intro. Thank you for your question, right? Often people just need to know, does this sound like an okay idea? Yes. Right? Full sentence. So those sort of things actually help build psychological safety. They help build trust and that vulnerability, right? I don't know, right? That helps in face-to-face. It helps a lot in virtual teams, right? I don't know. Let me see if I can find that. Is there anybody on this team who knows how to do that? Did I skip one? I did not. All right, next. Okay, so the last thing before I sort of talk a little bit more about the conference side of things is we are predominantly lazy technology users, which means we rely on text, we rely on email. If you're younger, you rely on Discord or something else. And we don't spend enough time thinking about what is the message I'm trying to convey and what is the technology that will best convey that message. So we're matching the message to the technology, right? Who needs to be on the meeting? How long do we need to meet for? How long does this message have to be, right? We tend to think like everything needs to be a meeting. I don't know about all of you, but I go to a lot of meetings where it could have been an email. Right. The other piece when I talk about matching is, right, personalize. It is fascinating now if you go back into the early work on virtual teams when people had to create their own emojis, right? When we did it with, the colon and the little bracket piece. And that was a smiley face. And, and people were thinking like, multiple, the multiple exclamation marks means this. What does that mean? Right? How can we personalize? How do we name our group chats? How do we, bring in pictures? All of those things help us realize, oh, this is a friendly message, or this is, something, from somebody I know or wants to be known. Oh, so my slides are out of order. Oh, so conflict management. Again, when you're in a virtual world, conflict escalates more quickly, right? Somebody sent something in caps. Are they angry at me, or did they just have their caps stuck by mistake, or they were short in that message? So we have to really think about how do we address something. And again, leadership matters here early on that says, I want to, that message upset me, or did you really mean, you sounded a little angry? How do we do that? Richer media helps as well, right? If somebody sounds angry, get on a call where you can see the person, right? Are they really angry, or was that just a very short message because they were running out the door? Same way that we talk about team charters, after action reviews. What worked well on this project? What didn't? Did we have our good norms? When did people interact? When did people, interrupt? When did people, ask tough questions, express that they didn't know what was going on? Was it too late in the project to correct, etc.? So up until now, I have talked mainly about sort of virtual teams and what we know in that space. So let's sort of move it to conferencing, if you like. And I'm thinking of conferencing, but sort of in three different buckets, right? There's the conference organizers, there's the presenters, and there's the attendees, right? What are the goals for each group? It would be very helpful to know that this conference is organized in such a way that, every hour you'll get a 15-minute break. And that break, is either a break, and we expect, where the expectation is that you go off and get some water, go to the restroom, get something to eat, put your feet up, whatever it's going to be. Or the expectation is, oh, that's when you go into, small group sessions and meet colleagues. And here again, there are a lot of technologies that can do this really well, right? So we're using a platform today, but again, depending on the size of the conference, number of attendees, goals of the conference, I've been to conferences where everybody has an avatar, or you can have it yourself, and then you can move into, your little person can sit in the conference room, or your person can sit in a little private room, and you can then talk to the person who is in that room with you, and no one else can hear it, right? And you can close the door and people can come and go. So again, what is the goal of your conference from the expectation, from the planners? What are we expecting from the presenters, and what do we want the attendees to get out of it? But the message is going to be, you have to plan, right? And there are cost benefits analysis, right? Do you, is this going to be fully virtual? Is it going to be hybrid? How are the people who are in person versus virtual going to be treated, feel that they're part of it? Costs of that still can often be quite prohibitive. And then at the end of the day, how do you engage your audience, right? Because we know, that people retain more, learn more when they're more engaged, right? It's not a one directional. So that they're taking notes, or they're being asked questions and they're answering questions. How do we give help and seek help, right? The things that we often hate, again, are icebreakers. How do we do that in a conference setting so that participants feel, I know who else is here, and this is part of my community? How do we build that community? Final piece, it's fascinating in the virtual world, and this has been talked about a lot today, so I don't want to just sort of duplicate. But when we think about virtual teams or virtual work, there are so many algorithms behind the scene that dictate how things will appear on the screen. So, one of the best things from a DEI perspective is that the algorithms dictate that everybody has the same size box. And when you come in and out, where your box appears, it's not done by seniority. It's not done by, any other criteria, right, that may disadvantage a certain part of the population. So, you come in and, your box is right there, right? The other great advantage of all of this is multiple modes of participation. So you're not somebody who would want to or is able to ask a question, right, in a session where this presentation is being given to 60 people live. But now, right, you can come in through technology and ask your question, right, anonymously to the group, type it in, or you can go back and look at slides at a later stage and really try and process things in your own time, right? So timing, transcription, all of these things can really help us. How do we accommodate different learning styles, different thinking styles, different physical abilities, right, to work in this space? But again, and I've said this a couple of times, we have to also realize that retention is going to be different in a virtual world, right? One of the reasons that we kept talking about over and over again, during COVID, was we were so exhausted. Why? It is physically mentally more exhausting when you can see yourself on the screen. So I am looking at my slides so that I can remember what I'm meant to be talking about, but I can't help but see in the corner myself. and we are predisposed to look at ourselves. So, often if I'm on Zoom calls with my team, I put, I do the really high tech thing. I put a Post-it over that because I know at the end of the day, I'll be much more exhausted if I've had to look at myself, forget being critical or anything else, right? But again, the mental strain is real. Again, from a DEI perspective, there is a pink tax, right? It is very easy for certain groups to just, appear on screen in a polo shirt, and yet we expect women to be camera ready. And that is something that, there's some work they're starting to look at, is what does it mean to be camera ready for different sexes, but also for different ages, right? So there's a lot of ageism here with regard to how you look on the camera and what does that mean. And then, accessibility, right? For some people, like looking at slides that have multiple colors or have images, right, is harder to process, is more draining. It's, more of a tax on your ability. So lots of advantages to doing conferencing planning when we're doing this in a virtual, but also, it's not a free good, right? We have to really plan, think, lead through, and realize that there are costs involved at the same time. So I am done with my piece of presenting and more than happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you so much for this amazing talk. It gave us, I'm quite sure, a lot to think about. I will probably rethink using a virtual background now. I never really thought about it in that way before. I'm going to use my moderator privilege to ask a question first. So you talked a lot about virtual teams, but I'm wondering about hybrid teams and how to make sure that the people who are virtual in the hybrid teams can feel included and valued. Are there ideas you might have for that?
Absolutely. No. And so it has to be very deliberate, right? Because you don't want to create an in-group and an out-group. And so there have to be times when, I would argue that everybody is working virtually. And so that you have a very shared common language and you do, sharing and, so again, I would laugh at like the beginning of every meeting, I might say, let's go around the room and everybody say what you did over the weekend. Again, doesn't really matter, but actually know it's going to help the team down the road. And you have to do that with your virtual group as well as your in-person group. But I would also try and work to make sure your virtual group feels connected as their own group as well, right? So that you have, because the in-person group are going to feel connected. They're going to go and have lunch together. They're going to go and get a coffee. How can you facilitate that with your virtual piece as well, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that does make sense. Oh,
and the other thing with hybrid is, we have to start thinking about this, right? Should people be in the office? Should they not be in the office? So for my stuff, I'm saying everybody has to be in the office, 1 or 2 days a week. But there is a shared day. And that shared day, when everybody's in, is less about getting work done, but more about building community and doing things that are going to be, things that we know are easier to do face-to-face and getting to know people and having some challenging conversations so that, again, on those face-to-face days, we use the time differently. We don't have a face-to-face day and everybody's in their office with their door closed, right? That's a bad use of time.
Thank you. So someone asks, so you mentioned that retention is different in virtual rather than in-person experiences. They're asking if you can say a little bit more about the differences in retention.
So often the retention, it's easier to leave because you feel less connected to the team, right? So we tend to stay in teams or in jobs where we like the people that we're working with. We know the people that we're working with. If we don't feel that connection, it's very easy to jump from one to the other. So again, how do you build that community in your virtual team to help retention is the big answer. The smaller answer is maybe you don't care about retention, right? So maybe because you are working on a project and you want people to come in and out based on their expertise, right? Retention maybe isn't the goal. So again, something just to think about of what, we're sort of in tune with thinking retention is really important because hiring is expensive. But again, if we think about this more as a specialized gig type way of working, maybe retention isn't quite as important.
Mhm. So another question that came in is talking about, similar to the trends of teams being more successful as technology and knowledge improved. We might anticipate that the level of effort to lead and plan virtual teams and it will lessen as we learn more about what needs to be done and how to lead and plan virtual teams and meetings. And we're wondering what your thoughts are on how long that might take us and what might we do to accelerate the process.
Yes, and I mean, yes, I mean it does get easier with experience and and sharing that. But the other piece of that makes it hard, but also makes it fascinating, is that technology keeps changing, right? So, how do we lead in a world where we're now using, virtual goggles, right? I don't know much about that. So I think we're going to have to keep, well, I mean, I think leadership is all, to me, the key part about leadership is learning, right? Your good leaders are people who are willing to learn. And that's going to happen whether it's in person or face to face. I think it's harder right now on the virtual platforms because our assumption was, oh, it's going to be so easy. Here's the task, everybody gets to work, we pull it all in and it's there. But it's not. And I think that is a recalibration. So from that perspective, I think it will become easier. But I think technology will keep changing. And so leaders are going to have to keep learning.
And that segues into my question is how does somebody learn to be a better virtual leader?
I think in the same way you learn to be a leader, I think it's observing things that work and things that don't work. I think it's learning. I think it's preparation, right? Get to know everybody on your team. What are their strengths and weaknesses? Familiarity as well as, professional. What are the team tasks? What has happened in the past that has been successful? What has happened in the past that hasn't worked? Ask the difficult questions. Be vulnerable. I'm not sure that is hugely different from face to face. I mean, it's still going to be, learning and figuring it out. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned using icebreakers that give attendees a feeling of community and knowing who else is there. There's a request for you to say a little bit more about that, that these aren't just whimsical activities, but it sounds like you're really saying that they serve an important purpose.
So they serve a huge purpose, and they can be whimsical and they can be strategic, and they, however you use them. Think about the underlying goal here is to get people on your team to know each other as people. Because the more I know about you, the more likely I am to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to give help, etc. So sometimes we do it in, again, I'm using the whimsical word here, the Padlet thing that I said, where you all put your most recent photo up, and then you have to get in small groups have to guess who it is. It's a complete icebreaker, silly, trivial. The activity itself doesn't particularly have the value. The value is that we're talking and then someone goes, oh, I didn't know you had a grandchild, right? Doesn't matter for the task at hand that you have a grandchild. The thing is, we know something about you and we're more likely to reach out. So, it can be done as in as simple as water cooler. And again, here's a really, a leadership piece of this. So you have a meeting that's, starts at 10 to, review the goals for this week's task. You as a leader say, I will always be on the meeting 10 minutes before it starts. So if anybody wants to talk about work or any other things, you can join me. The first time you'll get one person who's like, hi, oh, I didn't know if we really had to be here 10 minutes ahead of time or something, right? And then you can say, no, you didn't have to be here. What did you do over the weekend or whatever it's going to be? And then slowly other people will see, oh, it's a norm to get on a little bit earlier to just chat. And, you can do this in as many different, it can be just, multiple, you can just say, whoever comes in first, I'm putting you in that group, and whoever comes in second, I'm putting you, now you have to talk to Sydney. Now you have to talk to Carlos, right? Because you came in. Just facilitating these interactions and that building of community.
That's so helpful. I'm mindful of time. I'm sure we could keep talking for a long time yet. But I want to thank you so much for this excellent panel discussion, and thank you to everyone in the audience and for submitting engaging questions and for participating in this conversation. This concludes our day one plenary session. I'm now going to hand the floor over to Dr. Carlos Garrido to share the workshop day one summary. And I think that is Carlos's cue to come on camera. There we go.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Spot. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Carlos Garrido, and I am a Social and Behavioral Sciences Administrator at the National Institute of Minority Health and Health Disparities here at NIH. Thank you all very much for attending. We heard so many informative and exciting presentations today, and I would like to provide some high-level summary to close out the day. So earlier today, we heard an opening welcome from Dr. Jane Simoni, the Director of the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research at NIH. Dr. Simoni touched on the importance of behavioral and social science insights for improving scientific conferences and meetings. Next, we heard a keynote by Dr. Marie A. Bernard, the NIH Chief Officer for Scientific Workforce Diversity. Dr. Bernard discussed how the COVID-19 pandemic and rapid transition to virtual scientific conferencing led to some surprising benefits for the diversity of attendees, including women and persons from geographical diverse locations, as well as the overall number of attendees and reach. Dr. Bernard also reviewed the advantages and disadvantages of virtual conferencing, raising important topics and points to be considered throughout the workshop. And we just enjoyed the plenary from Dr. Lucy Gilson from the University of New Hampshire that provided a historical perspective of research on virtual work and delivered evidence-based strategies for optimizing virtual work. Dr. Gilson discussed some major findings from early work, including finding that as tasks become more complex, virtual team performance goes down, and that meeting face-to-face at least once improved team performance. Although virtual team performance has flourished past these nuances, challenges remained, including in the realm of communication styles, complex task completion, and how to bring relationship building into the technology space. Of course, Dr. Gilson also informed that leadership is also key to the functionality of virtual work, particularly navigating boundary setting norms, rules of rapport building. Dr. Gilson also provided key strategies for applying the optimization of virtual work to scientific conferencing. We had two concurrent track sessions. Track 1 focused on promoting diversity and inclusion in scientific conferences and meetings. In this track, the first session was a panel on cultivating inclusivity, advancing diversity and equity in scientific convenings. This session gave an overview of inclusivity gains and challenges with regard to virtual, hybrid, and in-person conferences. The presenters covered both structural and cultural variables for consideration, and also a variety of data-driven approaches to monitor conference setups and provide recommendations for bringing forth equity and democracy as priorities. For session 2 was a fireside chat on creating inclusive conference environments through disability inclusion and accessibility. Disability inclusion in scientific conferences is a commitment to creating an environment where all individuals, regardless of their disabilities, can fully participate, contribute, and engage by providing necessary accommodations, accessible facilities, and fostering a culture of inclusivity and respect. We want everyone to feel included and part of the community. For the second track, track 2, environmental sustainability of scientific conferences and meetings, Section 1 focused on sustainability in motion, charting a greener course for academic travel and career progression. Our three panelists discussed the culture of academic travel. In general, academic scientists appear to be concerned about the interest in moving toward lower carbon impact travel. The conversation touched upon the methods and tools for measuring the carbon footprint of scientific activities, including travel, the pervasive knowledge behavior gap in which knowledge of the climate impact on academic travel and flying behavior, and the importance of top-down structural approaches, including policies and guidelines for scientists to reduce the environmental impact associated with scientific travel. Session 2 examined redefining conferences, innovative formats for sustainable engagement. And this session provided an overview of the relative attendance of carbon emissions associated with various formats of conferences, Compared to in-person conferences, virtual conferences generally lead to increased attendance and significantly decreased environmental impact. In one example, 17 times lower, actually. So due to the removal of travel required to attend. This session also described a multi-hub conference format in which a single event is carried out simultaneously in multiple locations across the globe, combining the benefits of in-person connection with the convenience and decreased environmental impact of virtual formats. Thank you again for your active engagement throughout the day. And I will now hand it over to Jessica Gauda to provide an overview of the next 2 workshop days. Take it away, Jessica.
Thank you, Dr. Garrido. So next week on Tuesday, June 11th, please join us for Workshop Day 2. Tuesday's content will focus on themes of connection, engagement, technology, and innovation in relation to scientific conferences and meetings. And please be sure to join us tomorrow for Engagement Day, which includes several activities designed to promote networking and connection, from live poster presentations and Q&A sessions to one-on-one networking opportunities and multiple small group breakout sessions led by workshop speakers and NIH staff. Please attend and actively participate in these important conversations. Thank you again for joining us today, and this concludes Day 1 of the Future of Scientific Conferencing workshop. Thank you, everyone.